Hello and welcome to the 38th episode of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And as always, we're reading Anthony Kenny's A New History of Western Philosophy. In this episode, we're looking at ethics in the modern era of philosophy. We're almost at the end.
Yes.
Yes.
Only 3 episodes left.
Yes, after this one.
After this one. This would be one of the 4 last.
Yes. Yes. There you go. Good math.
I did that all by myself. I really like this chapter.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Maybe my favorite chapter yet.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Maybe not. I don't know.
It was very interesting. Hopefully
Yes.
we can make it interesting too for everybody listening.
That should be.
It should.
Well, I should have a lot of editorial comments.
I know you will. Starting off with Bentham in The Greatest Happiness of the Greatest Number. So Bentham believed that pleasure is the supreme spring of action, and he says here that nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong; on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, and all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. So
I think this is the most abhorrent system of ethics that you could possibly, well, not that you could possibly, I guess if you have a theory that the most pain is the best, I guess it could be worse than this.
Yes.
But in practice, this is just horrific. How do you calculate? First of all, it's so amorphous. It's so ill-defined.
Yeah, because basically his general definition is whatever causes the most pleasure is the action that should be taken.
Right. And so how do you calculate that? Is there a computation for an individual's amount of pleasure? And or do you just add up who says this is pleasurable to them and that makes it right?
Well, he kind of says that pain and pleasure, there's really no set definition he ever gives. It's just what people feel. And then he also says that quantification of pain and pleasure are, of vital importance to utilitarianism, but he never really sets up how you actually quantify that.
Correct. And it's like he doesn't, it almost would make logical sense if everyone had a good motive and shared the same valuation of pleasure and pain. But as we all know, there's all sorts of differing opinions as to what gives somebody pleasure, what gives somebody pain. I mean, like you play the Beastie Boys in some venues, and it'll be like rapturous joy. But in an assisted living facility, probably not so much, right? Although it depends on the assisted living facility. Older people may not appreciate it. So, I mean, how do you even contemplate it? And there's no underlying structure that says, wait, there's certain rules, and some things are going to be bad, and some things are going to be good. And of course, that's one of the criticisms of his plan. And I'm a big proponent of, I don't know if I agree with the natural law as far as the basis of it, but there has to be some sort of structure that you just say, look, even if everybody else, and it's a tyranny of the majority is what it really ends up with, because you're essentially taking a vote as to what we should do, and that was horrific back in ancient Greece when they tried it, and that's how Socrates got executed.
It's very much subjective principles that you're trying to apply in a universal sense that just doesn't really make a cohesive unit at all.
Right, and even if you have objective standards, it's still a tyranny of the majority.
Yes.
It's just, you just count up who is going to benefit from this, and to hell with everybody else. As long as you have a majority, and if you have a super majority, boy, you should really get crazy with it, you know? And then, I don't know if we get into this with Bentham, but what is the logic behind reproducing? Why are you bringing more people into this world? Because then you just have to dilute the total amount of pleasure divided among all the people. And then you start thinking, well, like there was a buddy of mine in law school. Did I share this with you?
I think so.
The 10% theory.
Yes, you shared this on the podcast.
Yeah,
before.
so
share it again.
Yeah, well, it's and he did it, I think, in jest. But it's
Hopefully in jest.
But he said, there's always a small percentage of people that are just not productive and are just a drag upon society. It would be much more efficient if we identified that bottom 10% and just eliminated them from existence, and the rest of us, the 90%, would be much better off. Of course, then the problem is once you have the remaining 90%, then those people start looking around and want to get rid of that bottom 10% again,
Yes.
and then you end up with one person left. But it wasn't really advocating for that. But Bentham, I would think, would agree with it, wouldn't he?
I mean, according to his sort of principles here, yes.
And especially, what if your society really gets off on murdering people, like cannibals or something? That type of society. Where people, have a glorification for death or dismemberment or eating the rival tribes, that his ethical system would say, okay, that's great.
Yeah.
There has to be some sort of universal standards, and there has to be some protection for innocent individuals. Individual rights just have to be part of an ethical system. And for him, there's nothing.
Yeah. And the way he kind of tries to defend this doesn't really work at all, because he really just kind of attacks other ethical systems, but really in a very straw man fashion. He kind of points to these religious systems,
right?
And he kind of says those are just asceticism, which is the trying to strive for the greatest amount of pain and the most lack of pleasure. Because he's kind of saying, well, these religious people, they just want to live in kind of that spiritual poverty, that sort of thing. Well, that's not good because that just causes more pain.
Right.
And that's really a straw man argument because the religious, ethical systems are really striving to find more happiness in the end.
Right.
And then he also contrasts it with the sympathy and antipathy, which really is kind of just trying to look out as much for your fellow person as kind of an ethical system. But he says, well, that's just judging your actions if they accord with your own feelings. So that's just subjective. And I think he just kind of completely misses that his own system is also completely subjective.
Completely and totally subjective.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. And I don't, and I think there are a lot of people modern day that follow his philosophy. Mm-hmm. We just have to figure out what's best for what makes us all happy and what makes everybody feel better. And you see that in our modern American society, especially on the left, but not exclusively, where people are like, well, we have to figure, whatever's best for most of us. And, why are those few people standing in our way? Let's get rid of those people and then we'll all be happier. And it's just dangerous. It's really, really horrible. And the utilitarians are missing how despotic their philosophy becomes in practice.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. I guess in some ways it's kind of a consistent theory where you just do a math problem, then do the equation, and then off with their heads.
Yeah. This is kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, but he just completely rejected natural law and natural rights. Kind of what he ends up saying is consequence is always better than absolutism.
Right.
So, it doesn't matter, if there are these set rules for how we act, as long as the consequence is better in the end, according to his better just being more pleasure,
right.
Well, that's good. That's better than just having these strict rules.
Right. And I don't understand why you'd have pleasure or even happiness as the ultimate value. I thought, the theories, was it Aristotle, talking about justice, and that is also hard to define. Any ethical system is going to be really hard to define when you get in the details of it, but at least there's a constant there. Mm-hmm. Here, it's just whatever everybody kind of feels and wants to feel. Yeah. And as we all know, our feelings about any particular subject change over time. Mm-hmm. It ebbs and flows. And how do you address that? It's almost like a tide going in and out. Mm-hmm. You're angry about something, and then maybe you realize, well, there's a lot of things that I thought 20 years ago were good, and now I'm coming on the completely opposite side.
Yeah.
Like I for instance, I didn't know why anybody would be opposed to the Patriot Act, which was passed after 9/11, mm-hmm. and now I'm like, those people I thought were nutcases talking about you have to rein in the government. Boy, they really were right.
Yeah, they were spot on there.
Yeah, when they kept saying, well, it's just going to authorize the NSA to spy on Americans. Oh, that's never going to happen. There'll be controls to that, and there's a court process for them to get warrants approved, and then it turns out the FBI falsifies the warrant applications, and the courts just say, you really shouldn't have done that. Mm-hmm. All these people should have been disbarred. But,
they're kind of following the utilitarian argument there with the whole Patriot Act as well. It doesn't matter as long as we get the bad guys, essentially.
Who we define as bad guys.
Exactly.
And anyway, my point was, my views on that have changed over time, and I think it's because of of better information, all that kind of stuff. But the same thing is true of, I think, all of us, especially as we get older, and then we have the experience, and we you're going to have a different attitude about different things, and I think when we see like the repercussions for these transsexual type, well, they're not transsexual, you're not supposed to say that. What do you call them? Transgendered. I think a lot of people are going to regret making decisions for their children or for themselves when they're in their youth, and there's no going back for some of it. But right now it makes them feel better, so let's do it.
Yeah.
Well, under Bentham's theory, well, that's great. But what if it's a 6-year-old? And shouldn't there be some sort of individual rights to that 6-year-old to not have those things subjected upon them? Well, if you're only calculating the 3 people involved, the mother, the father, and the kid, the mother and father think it feels better, well, why don't you do it to the kid?
Yeah.
I mean, it's, as you can see, it's I think it's pretty obviously an evil system. It's not just neutral, in my opinion. I think it's just horrible.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to go on a number of rants on this.
Well, we can still talk about utilitarianism, because now we're looking at John Stuart Mill's attempts to kind of modify utilitarianism.
Yeah, he does a better job.
Yeah, he definitely tries to improve it a lot, because he kind of says that some kinds of pleasure are better. We shouldn't just be looking at quantities of pleasure.
Right.
What's the most, kind of long-lasting pleasure? What's, the deepest, not just like surface-level pleasure, that sort of thing. When we're looking at our ethical systems, we shouldn't just be looking at, this instant gratification, but rather, pleasure maybe over longer periods of time and that sort of thing. And I think that's where it gets more reasonable.
Yes.
Because you're actually more considering the consequences, not just what the majority wants right this second.
Well, and unlike the analogy of a pig, as stated here, the quote from him, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied.
Yeah.
So there's some benefit to the human rights and and that, like you said, it has to be quantifiable and over time, and it's not just being satisfied or happy about one particular outcome. There has to be more standards. So I think that he improved upon it, but it's still a horrible philosophy.
Yeah.
And he has this like wasn't he the Superman, or is that somebody else?
No, that is Nietzsche. You're in the wrong
place.
place.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself there. But I like his theories about this a little bit better.
He kind of goes on to say that we've, found utilitarianism in different places as well. He kind of points to, the religious principles of, kind of martyrdom and that sort of thing, in which, you kind of rein in your own happiness, your own pleasure for the sake of others,
right.
In the hopes that there will be greater pleasure in the end. And he's kind of saying, well, those sorts of things are already utilitarian belief systems anyway.
Yeah.
So, we're not really developing such a new thing. It's a thing that's kind of happened before, but we're just kind of making it more structured, I guess, was his sort of purpose here.
Right. But I mean, he's still any sort of utilitarian argument, you end up, well, as Kenny even talks about here, that you end up preferring expedience to justice. The ends justifies the means for sure. If you're in this ethical system, because it's like, well, what does it matter if you had due process? We got the right result in this case. Ultimately, and it's really perverse when it comes to like the way we view our criminal justice system. As the saying goes, it's better to let 9 guilty men go free than have one free man convicted and go to jail. And that it would be not consistent with John Stuart Mill, because by their calculations, it'd be better to have that guilty man go to prison as long as you also get the other 9. You do the math, and it's bad for that one guy because a mistake. Mistakes are made. Liberties taken.
Yeah.
But still is lacking, even though he does make room for, hey, you have to have some sort of standards, and it's not just the tyranny of the majority, I guess.
Yeah. He also kind of goes on to say, because there are a lot of attacks sort of on utilitarianism, are we supposed to use this in every action we make and that sort of thing? And he kind of goes on to say, well, that's really not necessary. Universal happiness doesn't need to be the aim of every action. Yeah. Sometimes it's good just to do what you think is right without, having to go
Doing
through this whole
Right.
calculus of, what is the best for the majority and that sort of thing. He kind of, tones it down a little bit, so we're not, always thinking about the will of the majority.
Right.
Sometimes we can actually just do what we feel is right.
Yeah, which is okay, fine, but then it's not really a complete ethical system.
Yeah, that's true.
It's like, okay, well, for the vast majority of your actions, you just do what you think is right. But on these other types of issues, I don't know where he draws that line. Then you do the math.
Yeah.
I guess maybe public policy,
Yeah.
as opposed to individual decisions. Well, how does that ethical system really instruct me on how to behave on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah.
It doesn't.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of issues with that.
Yes.
I think I did a pretty decent job castigating the utilitarians.
Yes, I think you did a very good job. I think
excellent.
John Stuart Mill feels defeated.
Well, he's dead.
Yes.
So
Oh,
he
he really feels defeated.
Yeah, and yeah.
Yes.
I don't know. Did he believe in life after?
I don't remember.
I don't remember either.
He might have. Moving on to Schopenhauer on renunciation. Of course, Schopenhauer is
he's
the will
universal,
guy.
Yeah, the universal will guy, where you come into existence and then you just fade away, like you just melt back into the Borg.
Yes, essentially. So Schopenhauer says that every person has a nature that controls all of their actions, and liberty is really just an illusion, because all we're really doing is just following our nature, following this will. And he also goes on to say that the best persons are those who recognize their own character, strengths, and weaknesses. So really, in order to live ethically, we have to recognize kind of the nature of this nature that is controlling all of our actions. Kind of figure out, where we, sit in our mental state and how we make our own decisions, according to our nature. And that's how we live ethically, is to really understand that.
Yeah, and I don't know how he can even pretend to have ethical beliefs if we're all just doing what we're determined to do anyway. Where he doesn't really leave any range available for free will, I don't think. So what does it matter if you say something's ethical or not? You're going to do it anyway because you were determined to do it.
Well, he kind of puts it in a very strange way, the way like his happiness actually works in his sort of ethical system. He says happiness is really negative. What he means by that is he kind of uses the example of, walking is just prevented falling. Life is just postponed death. So in this sort of way, happiness is just postponed sadness, essentially.
Right,
if we were to do nothing, we would just become sadness, essentially.
Right,
and so when we make these ethical decisions, we're really taking a step backwards from falling over.
Yeah.
So it's a very strange negative instead of, positive. It's not looking at adding to the total good, but rather subtracting from the total bad, I guess.
Right. Interesting way of looking at it, I guess. But he also talks about, doesn't he consider like the most ethical person the one that abandons the will to live separately from the will that you're going to return to, I guess.
Yes.
And he also talks about like repentance, feeling bad about something you've done is really, not really a change of your will, which he thinks is impossible, but a change of knowledge of those actions. So it's not that you really feel bad or you're feel remorse for something. It's just you have gotten more information subsequent to your act that makes you change the conclusion as to whether what you did was right at the time. But I think that ignores the real reality that sometimes we do stuff and we know it's wrong when we do it. And that's really what a sin is.
Yeah.
Because if you didn't know it was wrong, then you're not
wrong at all.
Yeah. Are you really remorseful later, or have you truly changed your mind?
Yeah.
And you would say, well, no matter what, you've changed your mind as to whether you thought it was right.
But that doesn't change the fact that you were bound to do that action, essentially,
Correct.
according to his sort of nature.
Right. And he would say, well, repentance isn't really remorse as we understand it. It's just you were determined to do that, and now you've just decided that what you were determined to do was the wrong decision based upon the available information that was presented to you.
And kind of with that, greater information, kind of goes on to say, the way his ethical system really works to be a better person, you have to kind of renounce your own self, reduce the egoism, look at the others around you, and figure out kind of how you're impacting them as well with that greater understanding.
I tend to agree with that.
And he goes on to,
as far as it goes.
He goes on to say that the best person here to reach the highest ethical state, he describes this person here, if he takes as much interest in the sufferings of other individuals as his own, and therefore is not only benevolent in the highest degree, but even ready to sacrifice his own individuality whenever such a sacrifice will save a number of other persons, then it clearly follows that such a man, who recognizes in all beings his own inmost and true self, must also regard the infinite suffering of all suffering beings as his own, and take on himself the pain of the whole world. So it's very that, choice to go into poverty, that sort of thing. When you fully reduce, the ego, fully look outside of yourself, you kind of have to realize, according to his system, we're all part of the universal will.
Right.
And so to be in this highest ethical state, we have to realize that the sufferings of others are the sufferings of ourself, and kind of take on those trials with them to be the highest ethical person we can be.
Yeah, I think it's a bunch of hogwash.
Yeah.
Because first of all, nobody thinks that.
Mm-hmm.
That their suffering is my suffering. We all, I think, all understand that we are individuals,
mm-hmm.
and I don't know that he refutes that, but I guess he says that I guess the perfect person could somehow believe that they are not a separate individual; they are just part of the whole.
I guess, the perfect
everything's
person,
Gaia.
mm-hmm. The perfect person would be the one to, I guess, kind of reach the point beyond death before dying, essentially, to go into that universal will before even going into death.
Yeah. I did like that he thinks that, like, an example of the most evil person is Robespierre
mm-hmm.
and Nero, but I think he's mistaken. That because he mentions that the most evil person, kind of going in the opposite side of it, is someone that takes the delight in the suffering of others.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like the opposite of that one. But I don't think Robespierre, if you study him, necessarily took pleasure in all of the executions.
Mm-hmm.
Nero probably. I don't know a whole lot about Nero other than, what everybody kind of heard about him, but kind of a debauched person. But Robespierre, I think really believed what he was doing was just. It was in the best interests of the society as a whole. And I don't know that there's anything in his writings or attributed to him that he took pleasure in what he thought was necessary to kill all these people. Mm-hmm. And I think he was deluding himself.
Yes.
But in part because he was just power hungry and mad.
Mm-hmm. Robespierre, of course, being one of the leaders of the French Revolution.
I'm sorry. But I think he's a despicable person. Mm-hmm. So I'm amused that this guy Schopenhauer thinks he's like an example of the purest evil.
Yeah.
But I think it would be something more like Ivan the Terrible. Mm-hmm. Who is known to just torture people just for the fun of it. Yeah. That's a good example, a better example than Robespierre.
Robespierre would have been
more of an intellectual.
Mm-hmm. Would have been more of a utilitarian, really.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I tend to agree with the conclusion, but not the reason for it.
Yes.
But yeah, it's an interesting attempt at an ethical theory based upon no free will and really no individuality. Mm-hmm. I mean, how can you have an ethical system without having an individual person responsible for their actions?
Yeah, exactly.
You can't because they're not choosing one thing or another. Mm-hmm. They're just separated from the all-encompassing will for a period of time, so that they're not conscious of the all will. But that doesn't mean, and he doesn't believe that they have a choice to do different actions. They're just caused to do what they're going to do. What's the point of this theory?
To give him credit, his ethical system does fit within his metaphysical system, which I think is pretty impressive, considering his metaphysical system is really out there.
Right.
So he did, come up with a way to find a good person in this very, like we were saying, lack of free will. But at the end of the day, it's what's the point in believing any of this?
Well, how did that person come to that realization other than they were caused to? Because they really didn't have a choice to do it. I mean, there's whatever. We've talked enough about this foolish attempt at an ethical system without ethics.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to Kierkegaard, the moral ascent. Mm-hmm. So he believes kind of the typical person, people tend to be law-abiding and cultured, they're very different from, Schopenhauer's typical person, constantly falling into evil,
Right.
Kierkegaard says, well, they're just decent people, but they avoid entering engagements that limit what is immediately attractive. So even though we want to kind of do the right thing, we don't really want to go beyond what is good for us in that moment. There's very few people who actually truly desire the good for other people, in the long term.
Right. Well, and I thought it was kind of interesting when he talks about, I guess it would be a protagonist in one of his writings, where it was what distinguishes him from, this is the top of 933, what distinguishes him from a serious moral agent is that he avoids entering into any entanglements that would limit his capacity for the pursuit of whatever is immediately attractive. To preserve his freedom of choice, he refuses to take any public or private office. He avoids any deep friendships and marriage above all. And I think he's holding that out as a relatively ideal person, I guess. Yeah. To me, it seems like a jerk.
Well, he's saying it's a relatively typical person, not the ideal person.
So he's saying that's what everybody would do, and everybody's just a jerk.
Yeah, it's kind of what I was saying. They don't really want to go further than what is immediately attractive.
Their own okay, so that's his base person.
Yes, essentially.
So I misunderstood that. Okay. Well, that's pretty cynical. Maybe not necessarily wrong, but I tend to be pretty deeply cynical, but even I don't subscribe to that. I think people, I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I agree on some level. Like I do think, kind of what he says, they're a lot of people are just well-intending. They want to help other people. They're cultured, they're law-abiding, they want to do the right thing, but they don't want to go any further than that. They want to do, what's basically just required of them. They don't want to go too much farther.
Yeah, I guess there's some truth to that.
I think so.
I vary between that theory of human nature and kind of the polar opposite, which is people are generally decent.
Yeah.
And try to do the right thing. And if given the opportunity, they would. I guess it depends on if I'm being in a bad mood or not.
I think you flipped back and forth depending on episodes of the podcast on what your mood is at that time.
That's true. That's true. But that's a hard one for me to figure out. I don't know.
At the end of the day, we'll never be able to go into the mind of every single person. So, it's very, very hard to tell.
Yeah. And sometimes, you get disappointed in society, especially nowadays. And I think social media has given us a window into people's souls.
For better or for worse?
For mostly worse. Yeah. I think almost universally worse. Yeah. And it's true of me too. Things I share on social media I wouldn't share normally in a normal conversation.
Yeah.
So I've really pulled back from what little social media I've done.
Yeah.
Just because, you know what? I don't need people to know that about me.
Fair enough.
Anyway. Yes. So going on to, let's explain his theory a little bit more.
Yeah, well, he kind of goes on to say, not much of his real, what you actually should do is really kind of contained in here. He kind of just gives, the typical person and their ethical beliefs. He says kind of, a person in despair, a despairing person, really their big flaw, their big mistake is that they have no hope of anything higher than the present life. So if you're, just not doing good ethically, essentially, it's because you don't think you can really change things. It's because you think you're just stuck where you are, and that's kind of where you get into that loop of, I don't want to do anything more than what's expected of me.
Right.
So to kind of get to that higher ethical state, we kind of have to recognize that, it's more than just me. I have to kind of help these other people, on my way up as well to get to this higher ethical state.
And doesn't he think like those kind of like being married and having children and being part of society and contributing to society is more of an ideal? Right.
Yeah, that's what he kind of says. To enter this higher ethical stage is to form one's true self with a vocation.
Yeah.
Take on some duties to actually help the people around you, form relationships and that sort of thing.
Yeah, which and I'm endlessly amused by the fact that he never held a job and never got married.
Yes, that's very funny.
It's kind of like those communists who are so super wealthy. It's like, they don't really believe it because if they did, they just give it all away.
Yeah.
And so he's kind of like this same thing. Well, he has this theory, but then he doesn't follow it. Or I guess a better analogy would be television preachers.
Yeah.
And they live in mansions. There was one years and years ago that the scandal was that not only did they have this mansion and the plane and all that stuff, But I think what got everybody's attention is that they had a doghouse out back that had its own air conditioning unit. And somehow that just resonated with everybody. Even his dog has a better house than us. Central air in this stupid doghouse out back, you son of a bitch. And some old lady's giving him like $100 a month out of her Social Security check. To support, got his mission, godly mission. But then there's never ending.
Yeah.
And that's why when I was in my youth, I thought, I should start my own religion. It'd be a great way to make a lot of money. But it turned out I just don't have it in me.
That's unfortunate.
Yes. I'm not cynical enough.
Yeah, apparently. Moving on to Nietzsche and the transvaluation of values.
Yes.
So this is a very long discussion of Nietzsche. Very interesting.
I think he was almost the funniest.
Yes, probably because a lot of it is just insane. It's very crazy.
I do like, and I mean this not really, but I'm always endlessly amused, and maybe I shouldn't be, with how so many people blame the Jews.
Yes, he blames the Jews. Nietzsche blames the Jews again.
It's like, why? I don't understand. I just can't wrap my head around why there's so many people throughout history that blame the Jews, for crying out loud.
That's because a lot of the time, I know very vague reasons about this. It's because the Jews lived very much separately from the other people. They set up their own cities, and they were very wealthy.
And they're successful. They work hard, right? Mm-hmm. They support their own community. They live there. I get
and
that.
what really started is because they could survive plagues or droughts or everything, because they had been wealthier in the times when there wasn't anything. So seeing them succeed during the times of droughts and plagues and that sort of thing, made them think that the Jews caused the droughts and the plagues because they were still alive and well.
Yeah, I guess. But it just
it's very strange how much.
Well, anytime I see anybody who blames anything on the Jews, I always think in my head, it's the Jews. Like JOOOOS. It's the Jews. Oh golly, gee whiz! Yes. And doesn't he single out the 4 terrible Jews being Jesus? Yeah, Jesus, Mary, Peter, and Paul.
Yes.
And that's interesting. Mm-hmm. I don't know what his deal is.
And really where he kind of comes from. I even
have in the margins of his various comments, but I have, good God, next to, his theory of Christianity leading to the degeneration of the human race and all that.
So where he kind of comes from is he really firmly believes that Christianity is base and degrading. And the way he kind of looks at this is he looks at this sort of historical, well, not really historical because he kind of just made it up, but the transvaluation of values, in that there were 2 kinds of morality in the past. There was the aristocratic sense of morality, which he loves, which valued noble birth, power, and candor. And then there was also the poor qualities, and the poor and the aristocrats, separated because the poor valued kind of vulgarity, cowardice, untruthfulness. But then there was a shift. Because the poor people,
of Christianity.
Well, because of the Jews, of course. He blames the Jews, in which the poor people kind of turned those, unfavorable traits into favorable traits, humility and sympathy and benevolence, and those really only help the poor rather than helping the rich. And so that's where he gets this transvaluation of values, in which the noble people are suddenly the bad guys and the poor people are the good guys.
Right. I don't understand why he calls that Jewish values, because it's really Christian. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's a little bit of that in the Jewish faith, but that the meek shall inherit the earth is really a Christian value, I think, and turn the other cheek and all that kind of stuff. And so I understand what he's saying, but
he doesn't really have any historical evidence for it, of course. It's just kind of just made up,
right? It it's the opposite of Christian values. Mm-hmm. And doesn't really have any basis for anything. It's just saying, the right might is right.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating theory, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And so where he kind of goes with this, after this transvaluation, he says that Christianity is really based on the desire of the weak for revenge on the strong. So the reason for this whole thing is because all the weak, poor people really just want to get back at the rich people. And he kind of shows this, in kind of describing the acts of Christians. He says, they're only compassionate to exercise power. They're only philanthropists to, degenerate the sufferer, and pity only infects a person and makes them more likely to just give up and that sort of thing. It's just like,
that doesn't make any sense, because if you really wanted to punish the rulers, you outnumber them. There's always a few at the top. You just murder them and take the power.
Yes.
You follow the aristocrat or the powerful person's values as he defines them. Might makes right, or the strong, the fittest, and all that kind of stuff. Then if you follow their views, you would just murder them and take over, and then you're in charge and you're the good person. But that's not what Christianity and their value system would tell you to do.
Yes.
If anything, that the Christian value system would almost teach you to just endure the suffering and allow those powerful people.
It's like the whole give to Caesar. Exactly.
What is Caesar's? Don't hassle them. That the meek shall inherit the earth in the next life.
Yeah.
I don't see how that degenerates anybody. Although it does make you maybe more compliant. Yeah. But
well, even according to Nietzsche, nobody can really understand what is actually degenerate besides Nietzsche.
Right.
He kind of goes on to say, Christianity
should know.
Yeah, has lowered the strength of he's lowered the strength of mankind, and there's certain acts that either ascend us or descend us, but he's the only one who really knows which acts are good, which are bad.
It's hard to say.
It's hard to say.
Hard to articulate.
I know.
Yes.
Though. Yes. And then he also kind of goes on.
He's the guy with the Superman. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He also goes on to say that we shouldn't object to judgments just because they are false.
Yes.
And with that, he kind of goes almost into a utilitarian argument here, in that, even if it's, a wrong argument, it doesn't really make too much sense, as long as, again, the ends justify the means.
Correct.
His ends here, not just pleasure, but I guess, nobility and the power of the aristocrats, I guess.
Yes, and trying to develop the species to the superhuman level and whatever progress.
Kind of going back, I think it was to almost Hegel. I think it was last unit. And that one society is inherently better in bringing all of humanity to a better place, and we have to follow them. It's kind of that sort of thing here. If we uphold these good values here, that's what we should be striving for.
Yes, fascinating, bizarro type theory.
Yes. And then this is where he gets into the Superman. And so the Superman is essentially the ideal person who upholds these noble aristocratic values, essentially. The power, the nobility, the candor, that sort of thing. And he says that the Superman is the ultimate affirmation of the will to live, and that the will to power humanity is really just the path to being a Superman. In the end, we become more than human, essentially, if we follow these very noble ideals.
Right.
And that's where we get in our highest ethical state.
Yeah. I don't know what to say about that. He also seemed to really like war.
Yes, he says war is an education on freedom.
Yeah. Well, it's an education of sorts. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people that valued war and bravery and how it distilled your virtues and all that stuff. But
he kind of says the same thing about suicide. Almost, he said, if it's impossible to live proudly, then you have to die proudly.
Right.
He says, kind of essentially the sick are a drag on society. It's almost like that lower 10% thing, like you were talking about. Just
he's definitely a 10%er, man. He's like, get rid of them, or they should just kill themselves.
Yeah,
save us the trouble.
Yeah, no kidding.
Do something right.
You kind of
exterminate yourself. I don't have to bother with it. Yeah, it's pretty awful.
Yes, and in the end, it's very, very similar to Nazism. Very, very strong links there.
I would agree with him though that he calls himself an immoralist as opposed to a moralist, and I think that's absolutely right. Immoral as an immoral theory is very much like a Satan philosophy.
It really is.
It's an evil philosophy that would cause more harm than being an agnostic or an atheist who just doesn't even want to have a moral system and just...
Well, it's entirely focused on the self, essentially.
Yeah.
It's only what's best for me, makes me more powerful, more valiant, essentially.
Right. Yeah. He's a bad dude.
Yes. Very interesting to read about. It's entertaining, at least.
I tried to read some of his stuff back when I was in college. It was of course, an English translation, but it was very hard to... I didn't get anywhere into it because it was just really hard to read. So it's good to have a summary from somebody who's going to plow through it and
actually kind of knows what he's talking about.
This is the crazy stuff he's saying, so take it for what it is.
Yeah, exactly. So now we move on to analytic ethics, and here's where we just get very short snippets of individual. These are all Americans, I believe.
I found this part of it very boring.
Yeah, did you?
Yeah, did you?
I mean, I think it was interesting enough. Just these short little snippets of ethical systems.
Yeah,
a
lot of them weren't really even systems. It was just
kind of little brief notes about ethics. And so we start off with G.E. Moore. Where he says, goodness isn't this natural property, but can be a property of natural things. And that, there's really no this, objective goodness. We can just find goodness in things. And he says, friendship and aesthetic experience are intrinsically good. And those are the only two intrinsically good things in the world.
Yeah.
Any comments on that, I guess?
Not really?
Yeah,
I just thought, I guess that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. I'll kind of run through these guys pretty quick.
Let's just plow through them.
Mm-hmm. So A.J. Ayer then goes on to say, goodness is not a property at all due to the varieties of opinion on good and evil actions. So, we can't really ever find goodness because, our definition of goodness changes so wildly between person and kind of just over time. Yeah. I think that would almost be a counter argument to, utilitarianism, that we really have no idea what goodness is.
Right.
Then we have R.M. Hare, excuse me. He tried to make his own sort of ethical system completely logical, trying to make it almost completely like math-based, and eventually he really kind of didn't really succeed very well.
It's tough.
It's very tough to make everything a math problem. He says ethics...
There's exceptions to everything.
Yeah.
It's very hard to have an ethical system, I think. But go ahead.
He says, ethics is the study of features of moral language. So kind of going back to, the whole language is the root of everything. We study what actually makes things right to say and to speak and to write. And he also kind of says, he believes in a rough utilitarianism because he really kind of says, in the end, utilitarianism will never actually work because people are completely unwilling. Well, not completely unwilling, but in the end, most people are unwilling to be done by as they do to others. So what he's kind of saying there is, it's almost like most people are not willing to do unto others what they, or treat others as you want to be treated, essentially. He's saying people aren't willing to do that, and that's really what's necessary in utilitarianism, to kind of fall on your own sword if you think it's better for the rest of the people. He thinks people will never actually do that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but his system is vaguely utilitarianistic because it's very logical. What is the best overall?
Right.
But in the end, people don't want to fall on their own sword.
True. That's a very good point.
Yes. Thank you.
Oh, it's his point.
Oh, shoot.
That's a very good explanation of his very good point.
Then Philippa Foot said that
finally a woman.
Yes,
right?
A woman. Mm-hmm. Philippa Foot said that judgment cannot be treated as moral purely by universality and prescriptivity. So this is really what you're kind of saying here with the utilitarianism. We can't just treat something as moral just because, we think it's universal for this vast majority of people. We can't just say that. We can't just vote on morality, essentially. And she also says that moral beliefs must, cover actions that are beautiful or beneficial or harmful. So essentially, things that help or hurt is essentially what, all of morality is. That's what we're kind of looking at here with ethical systems. Yeah,
she's getting back into like the virtues and vices.
Yes.
Harken back to, I think, Aristotle. Wouldn't
it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so Peter Geach here also kind of says, further, kind of solidifies that goodness is always attributed to things individually. There's no collective goodness. We can say, this action was good, but we can't always say, this action will always be good in every circumstance, essentially. It's impossible to find this universal goodness.
I think he's right about that. That's the difficulty in coming up with an ethical system is how do you apply the system to all circumstances?
Mm-hmm. And then his wife, actually, Elizabeth Anscombe, said that morality is not law from God. And what she says here is that the concepts of obligation and duty, moral obligation and moral duty, that is to say, and of what is morally right and wrong, and of the moral sense of ought to be jettisoned if this is psychologically possible, because they are survivals or derivatives of survivals from an earlier conception of ethics which no longer generally survives and are only harmful without it. So what she's kind of saying here is that we shouldn't look at morality as a duty, because she really says, it's kind of going back all the way to the Ten Commandments almost, and how to live is just, instructed by God. She's saying that's not really something that exists anymore. We shouldn't look at it as a duty. We shouldn't be looking at it as following a law, this natural law, but instead we need a new system of morality here.
Well, and I like what she was saying there, or what Kenny's summary of what her beliefs are, because it kind of goes back to what I was saying, like, how do we know that the Creator God is a good? And I think, and we all do this, I think, and I think we have to do it. We have to come to a conclusion of what we think is right or wrong, and we're going to suffer the consequence. We may suffer the consequences if our value system is wrong.
Yes.
If God does not share our value system, and we're wrong, and we go to an afterlife, and God's like, nope, you did that wrong. And so I kind of share that in the sense that if God, this is going to sound really egotistical, but if God doesn't share some of my core values, I don't believe, I think he's wrong, right? I mean, if God thinks that murdering innocent children is okay, then I'm going along with that.
Yeah.
And God's wrong. Not that God's going to do that,
yes.
but I think part of her point is that you can't just have a system of rules that were handed to you on high without analyzing whether or not they were correct or moral.
Well, what she kind of
ethical.
says is, instead of, this sort of, obligation, we should kind of replace that with justice and injustice.
Correct.
Look
Right.
at these things, when we're looking.
We have to make a value judgment as to those values.
And
Yes.
Well, what she says with that is, she kind of defines virtues and puts it into terms what it actually is. She says, virtues are qualities for one's own sake and for others.
Yes.
It's not just what makes you a better person, but what actually improves those around you as well.
Yes. Agreed. Don't you agree with that?
Yes, I think that is a very, it's a brief, ethical system, but I think it's a good ethical system.
Right. And it's a foundation that you can build on.
Yes.
I think.
And then Bernard Williams.
That's two chicks.
Yes.
Two chicks
in one philosophy chapter. So
Bernard, that was for all you feminists still listening.
I don't think there's many.
Well, I like to acknowledge the ladies.
Okay.
Well, it's just, I've said this before. I'm going to say it again. We've gone through the summaries of great philosophers in Western philosophy from, what is this, like about almost 2,000 years, right?
Over 2,000 years. We start with Thales.
Yeah, that's correct. It would be before
2,400 years.
Right. And I wonder how much better off we would have been if women were allowed to study and write and create like they can now.
Yeah.
But maybe they would have just said a lot of the same stuff because a lot of these philosophers are repetitive, but don't you think? I think
there would have been some major differences, absolutely. Because I don't think we would have had, so many Nietzsches. Because I think that whole, valor and bravery.
I
really?
That. I don't think that women are better than men.
Well, I don't think so either. But I just think that, kind of inherently women value different things more than men. Possibly.
But I think women have different positive qualities, different than men, values somewhat. I also think they have different negative
values. That's what I'm kind of saying. Yeah.
So I think we might have more Nietzsche's, but also more other stuff.
Yeah.
Because I think Nietzsche's terrible. But I think you may have. But anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you. But
I was just kind of saying, because I think, almost, kind of inherently women tend to be more caring,
That's a bunch of bullshit.
Okay, never mind.
And I think when you really look to human nature, people say that women are more caring. Women can be the most evil people on the face of the earth, and so can men. So it just galls me that there's like this attitude that women are, they're more this and that. They have a different emphasis, but it doesn't make them better or more caring as a generality. I mean, it's my opinion. You can believe whatever you want, but I think that I do think that excluding them completely is a waste.
Yes.
Of a tremendous resource there were brilliant women that lived through the entire Western history, and we don't have the benefit of their perspective.
Yeah.
I think you agree with that.
Yes, I absolutely do.
I didn't let you make your point, but I think your point was they would have certainly had a different perspective than a lot of these dudes.
Yes.
And I completely agree with that.
Yes.
But to say that they would have a better perspective.
Well, no, I wouldn't say it would be a better perspective.
All right. Well, I interrupted you. So what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, well, I don't know. It doesn't matter at this point.
Yeah, I guess I completely ruined that discussion. But I
right.
get on my high horse when people, because there's a big push now, and I used to not be as a big advocate as I am now because I have 4 sons. And it really rubs me the wrong way when women say, especially women politicians will say, well, if women were in charge, we wouldn't have so much war. That's just not frickin' true.
Yeah.
Because, like even if you just look at interpersonal relationships, women can be much more destructive than men and much more evil to other people, but they just do it in a different way. Like, especially in the
I guess
youth.
what I was kind of trying to say is, we wouldn't have as many niches in that it's, kind of that sort of thing's more overt than in the ways, what I'm kind of saying, the big and the bold and that sort of thing. I don't think that's typically how women tend to think. Just a very broad generalization here. Sure. So I think, it would have been more subtle, essentially.
Interesting. Yes, more devious is what you're saying.
I'm not saying that either. Not quite that either.
All right, we got
there's one more philosopher here, Bernard Williams, and he kind of says, not a chick, no, not Bernard. And he says that happiness is largely luck based, and that we cannot really free morality from luck, because eventually, when we're talking about happiness and we're talking about pleasure, so much of that is just random chance by where you kind of end up in the world, and it's very hard to derive an ethical and moral system if we're looking at this sort of pleasure and happiness, because at the end of the day, a lot of things happen to you that just decrease your happiness, and they're not moral or immoral, it's just chance.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that.
But I don't think we should dismiss. We shouldn't just dismiss an entire ethical system just because, this person had some bad luck here.
Right.
They're just not as good. Yeah.
Well, it's like the story of Job.
Mm-hmm.
He had, of course, that was, I guess the story is that God did these things to him, but he suffered, tremendous tragedies and suffering and all that stuff. But his faith persisted, and it was a story of persistence and his character, let's say if it wasn't an active God doing bad things, testing him or whatever the case may be, if it's just random bad things happening to you, you should be able to still withstand, your ethical system should be able to withstand those chance negative encounters or chance positive things. Like so many people are destroyed by winning the lottery.
Yeah.
Because that was just by chance, and all of a sudden $10 million gets dropped in a lap, and 6 years later they're destitute drug addicts, because they just pissed it all away, and they cheated on their spouse and destroyed their life, and now they're living in a sewer, and they're horrible life, and so many people lose a happy life when just from chance. So I think I understand what he's saying, but I think it shouldn't change. It shouldn't be included. Chance shouldn't necessarily be included in an ethical system. It's just something that maybe a contingency you'd have to deal with.
Well, I think he's almost arguing against the formation of an ethical system at all.
Right.
That's what he's saying is you can't. It's just so much luck based.
There's too many variables.
Yeah.
I think that's wrong.
I think your ethical system should be be able to teach someone that despite any variables, you should be able to make the right decisions.
It should withstand those kind of chance encounters and those kind of contingencies that would happen you didn't anticipate.
Yeah.
It's either you have an ethical system that you believe is true and just, no matter what happens.
Exactly.
That's really the test, I think, of a moral person is what are they going to do? It's, the one is, what do you do when nobody's watching, of course, which is your ethical system based upon punishment or some sort of societal pressure or not? And then are you going to stick to your guns when it's dangerous? That's the other side of it. When somebody is trying to force you to do the opposite, are you going to stick with it? Like Christian martyrs. If somebody says, hey, you got to convert to worshiping the gods, our gods, or we're going to put you to death. And if somebody says, well, I guess you're putting me to death, man, that's ballsy, and that's sticking with your ethical system.
Yeah.
And, I think a lot of people would hope that they'd be able and willing to do that. I don't think any of us know until that day comes, and you just hope and pray you don't find yourself in that situation. Because I don't know what I would do. I would like to think I would know what I would do, but push comes to shove. Maybe I'd just say, okay, which statue should I bow to? I'll choose door number 2. Because door number 1, I don't want that.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
All right. Well, that was it for that chapter.
Excellent discussion, although I monopolized a lot of it.
That's all right. It was very interesting.
Was I interesting today?
Yes, you were interesting today.
Was I?
Yes, you were.
High praise.
High praise.
My teenage son.
All right. Any other thoughts on ethical systems?
Yeah, I think.
Well, what's kind of your ideal ethical system?
Yeah, I've been
very broad terms, I guess.
I've been trying to wrestle with how I articulate it because I was afraid you'd ask because I don't know that I have something I can articulate. I believe I'd have a very similar view of the natural law philosophers, that there are certain things that are always right or always wrong, and you have to have those categories. I don't know how I define them. Obviously, be very consistent with the Judeo-Christian values, but I don't know that I can, as I sit here right now, be able to articulate how I'd justify or categorize my ethical system absent the biblical influences. Because it's hard to do that. But I think there has to be, well, number one, a premise of any ethical system has to include free will.
Yes. Because otherwise, then nothing's ethical or
correct.
Unethical.
Right. So that's the foundation. You have to. It has to be free will. Otherwise, it's not ethical system. It's just you're explaining a physical phenomenon.
Yeah.
And then secondly, there has to be a set of values that would set forth a just world that protects other people from injury or harm in a positive ethical system.
Yeah.
And that there are some things that are just always wrong and some things that are always right. And then how to categorize it, I just don't know. I don't know how to articulate it. I'd have to think on it long and hard and write an article. Maybe I'll do it. That'll be my PhD thesis if I ever go back to school.
There you go.
Mark Bishop's ethical system. What are your thoughts? Have you?
I would say something very similar to what you said. I definitely believe that there are certain aspects of natural law. Like you're saying, there are universal right things that we should be doing, right values that we should have, and definitely like also with the free will and everything. But I don't really know much farther than that. I think we should absolutely be looking out for the people around us as well. Kind of what they're saying about virtue is for ourself and our sake and the others around us. Should we always be trying to help those around us achieve a higher ethical state as well?
True.
Shouldn't just be the purely what can I do, but what can I do to help others with that.
Right. Yeah, it's tough to come up with those standards, and what is the logical basis for it? That's not just that's what I think is right. Not like common sense or what you want to be right, or it's not just because God said so in the Bible.
Yeah. You don't want to pull a Nietzsche and say, well, only I know which actions are good or bad.
Right. Well, maybe I do want to do that.
Well, maybe you want to, but it's not a very sustaining philosophy.
It sustains my philosophy. Yeah. I know exactly what is right or wrong. Yeah, I maybe I should figure out how to actually put it down. Yeah. But it's time consuming. You really gotta.
Because you got to do a lot of background work with it too. Even to set up the even principles of why you think this is at all.
Right.
Kind of have to make it align with whatever metaphysical system you kind of believe in as well.
Correct.
Because that plays into it.
Right. Right. It's tough. I mean, it's easy to criticize, which I've done through this entire episode.
38 episodes of criticizing philosophers.
Of everybody else, and I'm like, well, you asked me, what is your system? I don't know. I haven't really given it a whole lot of thought.
I don't think we've put in as much time as they have, as any of them have.
Well, that's because we don't have the luxury that every one of these people had. Like, what's his face? Kierkegaard? No, he didn't have a job or anything. You know, you have these other guys that, well, like Karl Marx, let his children starve. You know, I mean,
or a lot of them were like hired by kings or queens just to be a philosopher because you know that was a job at the time.
Or they're in a university and that was their job. I mean, or there were religious orders, so there's subsidized by the church going folk and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So. Yes, that's. I need to get one of those gigs.
I don't know if any of those are very popular these days.
No, they are. If you're left of center, you can. There's all sorts of university type positions as long as you don't have the views that I have.
Just about.
It'd be hard to find a place that will subsidize, my thought-provoking ideas.
So now you have to start your own university.
You know that I actually, one of my papers, what was that class for? I designed a university in undergrad, a rough outline and I had it as a almost like a bicameral university where you had my theory would be, because I believe that the research side of a university is very important, but I think that the teaching side is just as important. So I had like almost a bicameral thing where the instructors would rotate in and out. So you'd be on a research side for a period of time, and then you'd be on the teaching side, because what good is a research if you can't teach? Yeah. And what good is teaching if you can't research, because you have to be stay up on things. So I remember doing that. I forget what that was for.
It's interesting.
Yeah. I don't know if I still have that paper downstairs. Probably, but I don't. I think our current university system is completely corrupt and bureaucratic. And I mean, like, it was just a story out the other day that was it Ohio State University? It was several major universities. I know it was University of Michigan. One of the Michigan universities had more diversity, not even academic, but like diversity bureaucrats than they had history instructors. Wow. The history professors and instructors were outnumbered by just diversity clowns who don't actually teach anything. Yeah. Just that their office of this diversity or that diversity inclusion. They had more staff doing that than they had teaching history. Wow. But there's a market for that. There's no market for learning history. Nobody. And there's these perverse incentives for that, but it's a whole different discussion.
Discussion for another time.
Yep. So maybe the two of us should maybe we should separately write our ethical systems, and then we can. Maybe I should have you ghost write, or I'd write my philosophical stuff, and then you can see about submitting it as your PhD. I can live vicariously through you.
I think that's very illegal.
Illegal?
Well, against.
If it's my consent.
Well, it's not my original work. It's plagiarism.
Would it matter? I guess it would.
Probably. Even if you've never published it, I think that's still plagiarism because it's not my original ideas.
Well, I don't think it's plagiarism if I give you my consent.
I guess not.
But I think it would be a fraud if you got a degree in a position based upon the work of somebody else.
Yes. It's also probably not going to work at all, considering, I'm planning on going into linguistics and not philosophy. So I don't think a paper about an ethical system really applies to a linguistics degree.
Well, I was just trying to figure out a way where that, because with your academic excellence, you can get me admitted to you could maybe attend two universities at the same time, where I would do the work on one of them and you wouldn't have to do anything other than submit them under your name, because we could do all these things virtually now. So maybe you could be in your university, but after you get your bachelor's degree and you'll have a 4.0, you'll be able to get any graduate school you want. And if I pay the tuition for my side, but we get a degree in your name, like a PhD.
With the end goal of doing what exactly?
I don't know, but I'm fascinated by it. The possibility
There's no point.
of me getting a degree, but it'd be in your name. Because I don't think I can get admitted to any PhD program.
You don't think so?
Not with my academic history. I didn't do very good in undergrad.
Did you?
I did not.
Oh,
I did terribly.
Oh,
Well, I did not. I didn't. I resented 5 credit hour courses because I thought they should be Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but they were Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and so I would just attend Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I resented homework because I believed that, and I also resented anything. I resented anything that was other than a test of whether I knew the subject matter. So I hated papers.
really?
Because if I knew it, I knew it, and that you should teach it to me. I should know it, and I should be able to prove that I know it.
No, I much prefer papers to tests.
Well, but why would I have to write out an exposition? Why should I regurgitate all this stuff or come up with something creative? Unless it's a creative writing course, why am I just not confirming that I know the subject that you taught, which is a test? And so instead of all this busy work, and why would I take multiple quizzes? Why don't I just have one exam at the end? I either know it or I don't. I either pass it or I fail it. And so anyway, I didn't do a whole lot of the work.
Yeah.
I didn't turn in all of my assignments.
Yeah.
And I didn't care if I got a good grade or not.
Yeah.
For the first 2.5 years of my undergraduate career. And then I decided, I probably need to get better grades if I'm going to try to get into something beyond undergrad.
Yeah.
And then my last 4 semesters, I was not a straight A, but pretty close to it. And coincidentally, that's when I started dating your mother.
Yes.
And so my mother, God rest her soul, was convinced that your mother's influence on me turned my life around. And she loved to tell me that for 2 reasons. One, she was firmly convinced that your mother turned my life around. And I think I don't know if I know she loved Rebecca more than she loved me. But I suspected it. And she liked to say it, number one, because she thought it was true, and number 2, because she knew it got me riled up. But it was literally the semester I met your mother that I coincidentally had decided, I need to start applying myself to college, and that's when I started doing better. And that's how I got into law school. That, and I tested really high on the LSAT, the law school admissions test, and I became a lawyer.
Yeah, there you go. It's a brief history of Mark Bishop. Yeah.
Yes. So I don't think based upon my undergraduate grades, I would get into a PhD program. And the law school at Carbondale was odd because they had a forced median. So you got graded on a 4.0 scale, but for every class, individual class, there was a median grade for everybody, 2.6. So half the grades were above 2.6, half the grades were below 2.6. And so it skews your GPA
That's
very
bizarre.
low. And so when you're applying for a job and stuff, they'll say, well, your GPA, I forget let's say my GPA was 3.2. Well, that's well above the median.
Yeah.
That was pretty good. It wasn't great.
Why do they do that? That's this weird system.
It's a great system, except for that it's so separate from what everybody else is doing. It makes you look bad. It makes you look like a dummy. But it was a great system because it fought grade inflation. You had to earn it.
Yeah.
And you got a grade relative to your classmates.
Yeah. I guess that. Yeah, I guess that because then it's like just a really easy class. Then
everybody gets an A.
Yeah.
If it's a really hard class, everybody gets a D or C.
Yeah.
But in their grading system, you're going to have half the people are going to be above. Now you can have, the teachers can grade it so that half the class has a 2.6 because that's still a median.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the half could have a 4.0. So you can, and then you tend to see a cluster at the 2.6 and just below, and then it spreads out above that. But it's kind of unfair, but it really fought the grade inflation. I don't know if they're still doing it that way. It's been a lot of years.
I've never heard of anybody doing that.
Yeah, I didn't either until I got there. And then I'm like, what the fuck? What is this crazy system? And then I applied for some internships, and they're like, yeah, you got your class rank is pretty good, but your GPA is really low. They look at me like I'm a retard. And I'm like, well, they have this forced median, and they look at me just like you did. I'm like, that's kind of crazy system. And they're like, looking at me like, is that for real? Yes, it's for real. And you had to explain it to everybody.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
And so that was a drag. But I kind of thought it was a good idea, and it's not a bad idea for colleges, I think, because it keeps the instructors honest, because they're like, they got to rank everybody. And so, the people that blow the curve kind of don't blow the curve. They're up at the upper end, but there's going to be a curve. It's going to be it may not be a bell curve, but half are going to be above and half are going to be below.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So yes.
Yeah,
so now I'm double handicapped trying to use my grades to get into a PhD program.
Yeah. Someday
I'll be a professional philosopher.
There you go.
Working nights at 7-Eleven.
All right. Well, this has been Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
And you can follow us on Twitter, capital U, lowercase LMTD, opinions with a capital O. That's good.
Good night.
Yes, good night. It's such a weird system. I don't like that grading scale.
System? Yeah. It was an adjustment.
Yeah. I'd imagine.